Richard, Joshua, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you both.
Pleasure to be here, Tevin.
Listen, guys, so I think for anyone who clicks this video and they're wondering what the title means, let's just set the stage from the get-go. Why do things come together at all? So why get together? From atoms to molecules, cells into bodies, parts into systems. It seems like there's this integration force within nature that seems to be bringing things together, this hidden engine. Perhaps we could start by explaining, why do things get together at all?
Richard, please.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a question that I've been intrigued by for a long time. So in the evolutionary transitions in individuality, you see entities that were capable of reproducing on their own, forming collectives that can then reproduce only as part of a larger whole. So the classic one is from the transition from single-celled life to multi-celled life. But there are several other transitions: independent self-replicating molecules to the first chromosomes, chromosomes to the first protocells, prokaryotes to eukaryotes, eukaryotes single-celled to multi-celled, sexual organisms, and so on. And there's a fundamental kind of working together involved in those transitions that I was intrigued by. And I always assumed that we were going to explain that through evolution by natural selection, because that's the textbook reason for why multicellularity occurred, why everything occurs in biology. And I couldn't make it work. When I was struggling with trying to find conditions under which organisms wanted to form collectives with one another. In particular, like if they're forming a collective, but it doesn't change what they do, or it doesn't change the rank order of how interested they are in particular behaviors, it doesn't really change any evolutionary outcomes. So that's not difficult to explain. It's like, well, I don't mind you being there, and perhaps you even make it better for me to do what I was already doing. But I'm not going to form a partnership with you if you make me do something I don't want to do. Those are the partnerships which are interesting. And those examples in biology include that property, right? So whilst multicellular organisms do well as a reproductive unit, some of the individual cell types within the multicellular organism don't do well, right? My skin cells, my heart cells, my bone cells, they don't make it into the next generation. It's only the germline that does. So there is this conflict of interest between components at one level. So that was the question I was interested in. And the textbook answer is, well, because it's in somebody's interest to do so. It doesn't make sense from the point of view of individual cells, but the textbook answer is that it makes sense if you think about it as self-interest at another level of organization, self-interest at the level of the genes, because all the cells in my body have the same genes, and now it makes sense that it's just my self-interested genes that are doing it. But that wasn't very satisfying either, because just saying that it's what the self-interested genes wanted to do, that's true for any evolutionary scenario. It doesn't explain something particular about the evolutionary transitions, right? It's not really explaining the phenomenon that was of interest. So the reason that I'm telling you this backstory is to answer the question of why do things get together is basically that my starting assumption was that it was in natural selection's process that explains that. Doesn't seem to be right to me. And it needs a fundamentally different kind of answer about why organisms get together. But any explanation in biology that isn't based on natural selection requires you to rip up everything, right? You rip up everything and start again if you're not going to base it on natural selection. And where I end up is a vision about how biology works that is more to do with entities wanting to know each other. That a fundamental longing for connection, deeply vulnerable mutual knowing, is actually the main driver of everything. And natural selection, differential survival and reproduction is a side effect of that. It's a side effect of wanting to know. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, Josh, how do you see this? Why do things get together? How does your view differ or align with Richard's?
I think it complements Richard's. from my perspective, specifically as a roboticist, someone who's interested in technology, we live in an interconnected age. We are constructing this technological civilization and making fancier and fancier gadgets and plugging them together, presumably with the hope that we will end up with something like the living world, a deeply interconnected, complex place that becomes less fragile the more things come together. And as we are all learning, that's not quite what's happening. So from a very practical point of view, as a roboticist and someone who's interested in technology, I want to know not just why why things in life come together, but how. There are many, many ways in which apparently you can come together and things get worse. And presumably there's at least one way, which is our biota, our living world, where you can come together and in a sense make things better. And we clearly don't understand how that happens, and we can't translate it into technologies and artificial systems. So, aside from the intellectual interest, I feel like a pressing, urgent social need to figure this out. We're not going to stop putting things together. We can't, that train is moving. We've got to figure out while it's moving how life gets together, why life gets together, and how do we build technologies that do it in the right way, not the wrong way. Full stop.
Yeah, I think so. You've both set a nice base that we can start building upon. So let's go from these deep principles of assembly. Let's move forward. Richard, your work suggests, obviously, as you just said, that natural selection is only part of the story. What is evolution by natural induction? And why might creative transformation require a deeper mechanism deeper than selection, let's say?
So we can just press the button on a long monologue here if you're not careful. So I'll try and stick to the point. There are basically two kinds of adaptive process in the natural world. One is natural selection, where you have a population of things, they vary at random, some of them survive and reproduce better than others, and that changes the frequencies of things in the population. The other process of adaptation is learning. Learning doesn't necessarily involve a population, it doesn't involve random variation. The changes in the organization of a system can be directed, not undirected, and it isn't about survival. But it can produce solutions to complex problems. You can learn how to solve problems better with experience. But learning seems to be something which is only relevant to systems that are built for the purpose of doing learning, either brains that were evolved by natural selection to do learning, or perhaps machine learning systems, artificial learning systems that were designed by us to do learning. So although learning is a different kind of adaptive process, it seems like it's somehow derivative of selection or design, that it wouldn't occur spontaneously or naturally, right? But natural induction is the idea that learning can occur spontaneously in natural systems with suitable properties. The word natural in that context makes sense. The word induction is there because it's the type of inference that learning is. So inference has two kinds, deduction and induction, crudely. Deduction means you're going from a general rule to a specific example. The classic case is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And that conclusion, that inference is logically follows from the premises. Induction is the other way around. It goes from specific instances to a general rule, such as this swan is white, that swan is white, all swans are white, right? So you get a general rule from some specific examples, right? Now, that's interesting because it's the inverse of deduction, but the first thing you're going to notice is, but it isn't logically sound, right? You can't conclude that all swans are white just because you've seen two of them and they were white, right? And indeed, induction famously isn't logically sound. So why would you be interested in it? Well, you have to be interested in it because you can't do learning without induction. Learning means I'm going to show you some things, and maybe I'm going to show you what you should do in those familiar scenarios. But I'm not interested in your ability to just remember them. I'm interested in your ability to apply what you've learned in new situations that you haven't seen before, classify new pictures of cats that are not like any other picture of a cat you've seen before, right? It's the generalization that matters. Generalization means always that you go further than the training data, right? It's intrinsically necessary that you do induction. So that's why it's called natural induction. And the work that I've done with Chris Buckley at Sussex University shows that if you have a dynamical system described by a network of interactions between some variables, could be as simple as some masses connected by springs, right? And the positions of the masses are going to be pushed around by the springs and their connection to the positions of the other masses. But that could stand in for all sorts of things. Species densities pushed around by species interactions, protein concentrations pushed around by protein interactions, gene regulatory expression levels pushed around by gene regulatory interactions, a network of any kind like that. And the connections between them are sort of springy in so much as, you know, they have a sort of a natural propensity to push things apart or pull things together. But also they're a little bit plastic, that they don't keep their same natural length, but they give way a little bit under stress. You call that a viscoelastic connection. So it's a little bit viscous, a little bit elastic. So for a spring, well, that's any spring, which except an idealized spring. Any real spring is a little bit plastic. If you stretch it too far or hold it stretched for too long, it gives up a little bit and it becomes a little bit longer. So that when you let it go, it doesn't go back all the way to where it was before, right? It might go back a bit, but it doesn't go back all the way. It's a little bit plastic. So a network that has that kind of plasticity is able to do the same kind of learning that a simple associative learning neural network would do. And that means that it can do all the same clever tricks that a simple neural network can do. It can form an associative memory. It can generalize to produce new patterns or categorize instances that were not in previous experience. And it can learn to solve combinatorial optimization problems better with experience. There, the problems have to be coded into the original weights of the network, and the plasticity of the network enables it to solve those constraints better over time. So if you can do that kind of learning and problem solving with just a network of springs, nothing special about the way that they're connected. They're not connected in a way that's engineered to make them do learning. It's just what they do, right? Then that suggests that learning doesn't require a system that's evolved for the purposes of doing learning, and it doesn't require a system that's designed and engineered for the purposes of doing learning. It will happen spontaneously in any dynamical system described by a network of interactions where the interactions give way slowly under stress. And there are all sorts of natural, physical, and biological systems that have that property. So the idea is that natural induction provides a mechanism by which dynamical systems can learn to better resolve the frustrations between their components over time without selection being involved.
Josh, anything you'd like to add to
that? I guess tying this back to the theme of why get together, part of the theory of natural induction, as I understand it, is shocks from the outside. As Richard was saying, the world pushes and pulls on networks of springs in interesting ways. One of the things about physical systems beyond just biological systems is when they're hit by things from outside, they start to break apart, they wear down, entropy increases. And from a physical mechanical point of view, things get more complicated and more diverse within. If you have a sheet of, you have a stack of paper, you take a single piece of paper and crumple it up, take a second piece of paper and crumple it up, they're not going to be crumpled up in the same way. You can't do it. There's a generation of diversity that comes just from mechanical fatigue, that sort of thing. And So for me, it's interesting because that connects to why get together and diversity. I want to get together with others that are not just like me. You often get this for free, outside the scope of biological evolution. And often when we talk about the generation of diversity, that very phrase connotes, some sort of evolutionary drive or some sort of evolutionary tendency. So among many things that I think are fascinating about Richard's theory of natural induction is it starts to explain other things happening, other ingredients for things that happen in biological evolution that are not evolving within the frame of biological evolution. They just happen, as Richard said, naturally from outside, and possibly biological evolution exploits that in ways we have yet to understand.
Yeah.
I think what's beautiful is watching all of this happen, all you guys coming together with such different, unique work, bringing them all together, and they all seem to be coming together so beautifully, which ties in very well here. And by the way, guys, if there's anything that one of you say that you'd like to add on, feel free. Just pretend I'm a fly on the wall at that point. But Josh, your work in evolutionary robotics, it shows us in many ways how organisms and machines form structures that surprise even the designers in your case. What does your work reveal about how systems come together without top-down control?
There are many theories about why things or folks get together within the bounds of biological evolution. If you're being eaten by a larger predator, guess what? There's an evolutionary pressure to get bigger, right? Or to come together. So Tevin's chasing Richard, Tevin's chasing Josh, but if Richard and Josh get together, now it's going to be harder for Tevin, right? It seems obvious. There's lots of theories about there of why multicellularity occurs, why things get bigger, why things get more diverse. But some of our work in evolutionary robotics says there's absolutely some other non-obvious reasons why. So maybe we really have only just scratched the surface. We often get hoodwinked, I think, by looking at biological evolution, saying, yeah, it makes sense why this got more complex and this got bigger. But again, as Richard has shown, there are many mechanisms at work outside the frame of biological evolution that are feeding into that. And there are many non-obvious explanations for why things get more diverse, more complex, why they come together and get bigger, and so on.
Mm. One of the things that, I still don't know how to make sense of it properly is how that working together works at multiple levels of organization. The network model that I was just talking about is a system which is capable of learning about an environment or its own behavior and response to an environment, becomes more easeful over time, so that it's, if it was a neural network, you would say it knows more about its environment. So the network as a whole can learn about its environment. But it's also true that the individual connections between components in the network, the springs are, as they relax over time, in a very primitive sense, they are learning about the interface between the two particles that they connect. If the two particles that they connect spend a lot of time that's far apart, they come to represent that long distance. If they spend a lot of time that's close together, they come to represent close together. But one spring can only represent one scalar value in its length. About like all it can know is whether things are close or far. It's not much of a relationship between two particles, right? But two networks can potentially know quite a lot about each other. Like one neural network can learn about another neural network, or learn about an environment, or learn model one system modeling another system. So the degree of internal degrees of freedom and dimensionality within a system changes its capacity for coming together in a way, learning a relationship, forming a relationship with one another that's richer and more multidimensional. But that can itself be just one link in a larger network at a higher scale of organization. But I don't know how to do that yet. I can only do the one level thing, right? And then we can see that biology does that, because biology has I was going to say gazillions, but that might be overstating a bit. But biology has a lot of different levels of biological organization, each of which creates components that look fairly self-contained, right? They are all capable of forming relationships with other components at that level of organization, either homogeneous or heterogeneous. And some of the relationships that they form, or some of the situations that they get themselves in, push back on the components that makes the components change who they are inside. Like that transforms them. They're not just learning how to behave in relationship with another component, but they're being changed. What does that mean? It means, well, when you look inside that component, it wasn't just a ball on a stick, right? When you look inside that component, it was another network. And in that network, there's a whole bunch of components with a whole bunch of interactions between them. And when under stress, those relationships can change, and it changes the behavior of the component, which changes its insides, but it also changes its outsides. And that was one of the themes that I wanted to pick up on that piece of work that Josh shared with us about the heterogeneity of components in collectives and their ability to, how that affects their ability to adapt to the situation that they're in on the outside.
And I think this is part of the reason why I suggested the title for this podcast be "Why Get Together." That phrase connotes, individuals, plural, forming a collective, and that collective means something. It has meaning, but neither goes away. Neither the individuals nor the collective. And even in that situation, imagining two individuals that are closely coupled, that form a collective that's worth talking about the collective and not just talking about the individual, it already gives me a headache, right? It's human intuition seems to resist or to really struggle with thinking about, reasoning about phenomena that are simultaneously occurring at different spatial scales, across temporal scales. Mike Levin and I are doing work on polycomputation, where you have a material that's simultaneously vibrating at different frequencies and computing functions at different frequencies at the same time in the same place. These are still simple materials, but like Richard was saying, it's X all the way down. This is becoming a stale meme in our community, right? It's cognition all the way down, it's agency all the way down, it's natural induction all the way down. But like old jokes of it, it's true. It is all of these things all the way down. And I think as a community, we're just on the brink of realizing that and taking that seriously, and it's causing us to have to rethink a lot of our common assumptions. Some of us still use the personal pronoun I, right? There's a singular thing, and most of us agree, okay, that pronoun means more or less, this thing, but not so much this thing, kind of, but we are a we know it's true, and yet it's so much easier to ignore what's going on under the hood, right? We're a ball on a stick, we're a brain on a stick. That's what we mean by I. It's worked well so far, but as biology and AI, advances, it's getting harder and harder to hold that intellectual position.
Yeah. That's sort of fundamental ontology, where there are things and there are relationships between things. It's like, if only the world was so simple, right? You're like, can somebody just write down what the things are, and then we'll figure out what the relationships are between them? And it's never that simple, right? So I think that in non-biological systems, we're used to this idea of there's still true that there are multiple scales of organization, right? You can talk about subatomic particles and atoms and molecules and materials and components, and it works at many different levels of many different levels of physical organization. And we're used to taking, physicists are used to taking a sort of a coarse graining attitude towards things of like, well, for now, I can describe this system at this level of organization, and I don't need to look inside. I can describe the pressure of the gas. I don't need to describe the positions of all of the molecules inside. But biology has this different kind of relationship between the levels. And I think that that's what makes living things different from non-living things. So in non-living things, the relationship between the levels, what you mean by doing the coarse graining is that all of the detail at the lower level sort of averages out, so it doesn't really matter, right? And we can just describe it as a center of gravity or something like that, or a pressure at the higher level. And if I move something at the higher level, all that does is just move everything at the lower level. So there's a sort of simple relationship between them. But biology has this way of saying, there's these components and they interact with each other. And, they have these, I can describe the components as having a relatively fixed repertoire of behaviors. And that's why the system as a whole does the behavior that it does, because of the behavior of the components. But then there's this sort of pushing down to other levels of organization, that when you do certain things at this level of organization, it changes the organization of the components that you were dealing with. And sometimes, indeed, it changes them and be like, I'm not really sure that's a thing anymore, right? Like I wanted it to be the case that this gene produces this protein and it does that pathway, and sometimes it does. But in this other circumstance, it's doing this moonlighting thing and it does this completely different other pathway. It's not like thinking of it as one thing isn't really sustainable anymore. It's more like a probability distribution over possibilities of what it might be doing. But there's no point, it's not good enough to just model it as an average either, or, just as a probability distribution, because you need to know the particulars in order to understand what the organism is doing at any particular moment in time. Mm-hmm. And that communication between levels, now the system has become a different system. It's not the same system it was. It's not built out of the same components. It's changed into a different kind of system because of its past experience. And that's what I would call learning, and it's what I think is intrinsic to making the difference between, inanimate things and living things, is the way in which they hold history over time.
So guys, to me, it seems like this is a new evolutionary era. Do you feel like this is what we're entering? If evolution, development, cognition, and computation are converging, what happens when these adaptive processes merge in biological, digital, and hybrid systems? Where are we headed?
Good question. I hope there are still distinctions. There's things over here and things over here. The current things that we have, cognition, consciousness, free will, agency, sentience, maybe these were okay for a while, but clearly they're all getting mashed up together and they're doing less and less useful intellectual work for us. So we're entering this, morass, which is kind of fun from an intellectual point of view. It's very messy, which is both good and bad. But yeah, what are these new concepts that are going to occur? I would say I think natural induction is a good example of something that might survive. Richard was just talking about how things are fundamentally different at different scales. While Richard was saying that, I was trying to imagine, natural induction being exploited by biological evolution at the macro scale. So you look at human physiology, and we are kind of a bunch of viscoelastic springs, but you zoom in and then you see basically mostly close packed spheres, cells. You zoom in again and you see a thick stew of, intracellular fluid with some things kind of banging around. In Richard's paper and beyond, you can imagine natural induction occurring in different ways in those very, very different physical environments at different scales. Mm-hmm. So I would, when I look at what Richard's doing, I say, okay, there is something that's constant there, this thing that he calls natural induction. It's generally, it exists in the physical world. It's just there. It just happens. It's likely that evolution will make good use of it. And why not make use of it at all size scales? There's nothing size specific, or there's no spatiotemporal specificity to what Richard's describing. It doesn't have to only work at the cellular level or at the organismal level or beyond. So I think there will be things, hopefully, at the dawn of this new era, we can say, yes, this phenomena is constant, but these other phenomena, the way in which things are instantiated, they're constantly in flux. And from Mother Nature's perspective, that's a good idea. It should be done in very diverse ways so that she can diversify her portfolio. But who knows? Yeah. Richard, what do you think? What is the
one of the systems that has intriguing possibilities for me is the possibility of learning at the ecosystem level. So you have an ecosystem of species with a lot of interspecific relationships between them, and that determines the ecological dynamics of that system and what its climax communities are and such like, how it copes with in particular environmental conditions. But the conventional natural selection view is that, yeah, okay, that system's complicated and it contains biological units, evolutionary units, but it isn't an evolutionary unit because the ecosystem doesn't have ecosystem babies that have differential survival and reproduction. It's not a Darwinian unit, so it can't be adapted at that scale. But if you think about it as a learning process, the fact that each of the species is co-evolving to one another over a distribution of conditions that the ecosystem has observed in the past, it can learn by natural induction to become more easeful with those conditions, to become better able to find configurations where its components are less stressed by those environmental conditions. And that's not nothing, right? So it gives a possibility of different scales of organization being capable of adaptation that aren't capable of adaptation under natural selection alone.
Mm.
And Richard, when you say that learning and evolution are not separate processes, how do bodies' development and learning integrate into a single adaptive framework?
Yeah. So recently I've been thinking more about, having established the idea that natural induction is an adaptive process that can happen independently of natural selection. The next question is, yeah, but natural selection. So how do those two processes interact with one another, right? So one obvious possibility is that, well, natural selection is trying to evolve organisms that survive and reproduce. But if those organisms have natural induction capabilities, that would be something that natural selection could harness for the purposes of enhancing survival and reproduction. But when you think about it in the ecosystem story, it's more the other way around. The ecosystem is doing learning through modification of the connections. And the reason that one connection evolves to be weaker or stronger or more competitive or less competitive is because of the stress that is placed on it by the configuration of the ecosystem. And the way that it accommodates to that stress is by creating selective pressures within the individual species, so that this species is now under a selective pressure to become less competitive or more competitive with some other species, or to change its utilization of resources, to change the connections in that network. So how should we think about that? Should we think about that as the natural induction at the system level happens because each of the species were adapted by natural selection? Yeah. Or the system as a whole is adapting by natural induction, and the way that it does that is by orchestrating the selective pressures on its component parts. I think that's a more, well, I at least think it's a possibility, right? That you can have a system which is doing adaptation at timescales which are too fast for natural selection and don't involve any genetic variation and selection. Organisms in a population have already adapted to a change in environment. This is Mary Jane West Eberhard's theory of phenotype first adaptation. Organisms in a population have already adapted to a change in environment. And the fact that they have changed the configuration of their behavior, their morphology, their physiology, their gene expression has already changed in response to a change in environment. And that changes the distribution of selection coefficients on future mutations which occur in that population. So it's not that you're waiting for a mutation to give you an adaptation. It's like, no, the phenotype has already done the adaptation. The genetic changes are following behind, and they're forming, if you like, a different time scale of learning, a different time scale of memory, a different time scale in which the past can influence the future. But it's being led by the fast time scales, not the other way around. So there's a possibility there for turning our intuition the other way around, so that the prime mover of the adaptive story, including the evolutionary story, is learning. One system coming to know another system through experience of contact. And there are many different substrates of memory involved in that learning, right? In order to learn something, it has to be the case that the past influences the future, which means you have to hold some state for long time scales. And there are many different biological substrates which can hold state, and some of them are fast and some of them are slow. It might just be a protein concentration in a cell or a gene expression level in a cell that doesn't last very long. It might be an epigenetic state which lasts a bit longer and could maybe travel through a few cell divisions. Or it might be a genetic change, which lasts many generations. But they're all principally processes of learning on different timescales that are interacting with each other, not genetic evolution drives everything. And one of the things that it can drive is the way in which you do natural induction, right? So there's a possibility for turning the story around there. And why that's exciting for me, apart from the fact that who doesn't like a new theory of evolution that throws out natural selection? Part of the reason that that's exciting for me is because it changes what the motivation of life is, right? The motivation of life under natural selection is everything we do, we're doing to survive and reproduce. The motivation of life under natural induction is, I just want to know. I just want to become a better model. I just want to form relationship with you, which is more easeful. And as a consequence of that, it will have effects on all sorts of things which persist at different timescales, including the persistence of organisms over time, lineages over time, macroevolutionary timescales. Those are all involved in the story, but they weren't the driver of the story. Mm-hmm. And that way you get to have the possibility of things coming into a relationship of mutual knowing with each other, because that's just what they do, not because I want to know you better so that I can exploit you or outcompete you or survive longer than you do or competitively exclude you, right?
Josh, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I love this, right? Listening to Richard and this exposition, I can feel myself relaxing, right? It's okay. It's not so red in tooth and claw. There's a different way of seeing things. So I think there's a profound point here that Richard is making, and there's also a humane thread running through all of this. That by turning things on its head, you can, again, now looking at this through a technological lens, optimization, improvement, efforting. It's kind of like the method of last resort, that when you really look carefully at nature, a lot of things just happen because they happen. And that's very alien to, a technological point of view. We are all very infatuated at the moment with, optimizing machines and making them better, and 1% lower test error, and, 1% fewer pedestrians killed by autonomous vehicles. Great. That whole framework, that there's so much more we could potentially do, in a technological civilization surrounded by technology that just does what it does. It conforms, adapts effortlessly, whatever we mean to that. And when it needs to, then there is some explicit, selection, reward, producing version 2.0 of some components. But it's not the assumption. It's not start with that. It's the method of last resort. That just thinking like that, again, from a technological point of view, it presents a very different way to think about building tools.
Yep. Look,
that's the best feedback ever, Josh, that you feel more relaxed when you hear the story.
We should do this again sometime, like tomorrow and the next day. My daily practice.
Look, it's only going to get later on, because we're going to touch into some of the concepts of love, meaning, creativity, etc. So I think it's only going to get more relaxing as we move forward.
Okay, good to know. I also want to build on what Richard was saying, is looking above at ecosystems. In our work with robotics, we're increasingly trying to design, machines within machines. So looking inward and downward. And we have some recent work, which Richard already kind of mentioned, where we're building robots that are made up of internal diversity. So when you zoom in on the robot, you see it's made up of a bunch of smaller robots. but no two of those smaller robots are exactly the same. And they're constantly they're semi-independent. They're constantly negotiating with their neighbors. And to adapt Richard's, phrasing, they're trying to get to know each other for a very good, practical, cold, utilitarian reason, which is that if you take this robot made of robots and you put it in a brand new environment, new from the perspective of the outer robot, right? So again, we got to pay attention now to things happening at different size scales. You take someone who grew up near the equator, you bring them here to snowy Vermont, and they start slipping on the ice. They've got about 1/10 of a second, before disaster strikes. I'm actually looking out my window. It's very icy here today. I'm watching the students skate around on the sidewalk. Amazingly, most folks who've never slipped on the ice before, they recover. Not always. It's like a magic trick. You see this in nature all the time. You take an organism out of its natural environment and place it in a situation that it or its ancestors has never experienced, and it does more or less the right thing. Seems like a magic trick. How do you account for this? The moment you start zooming in our case, on machines within machines, there's internal diversity. And because of that diversity, as the sensation of slipping on the ice starts to percolate inward and every component or cell inside gets its very small slice of the current percept, the current experience, they're all getting a slightly different slice of the pie. They're all having a different local experience of this slipping on the ice. And because they're internally diverse, the probability goes up that someone is going to raise their hand and say, you know what, this is not surprising to me. The local percept that I'm getting from what's happening to us falls within my experience. So I literally know what to do. I know how to keep doing whatever it is I'm supposed to be doing. And by the way, I can feel that my semi-independent neighbors, who I've gotten to know better, as Richard was saying, I've spent a lot of time understanding them and their foibles and all the rest. I can see that they're freaking out. They're surprised. They don't know what to do, but I do, which means I know how to pull and push on them to pull them back into a situation that's more familiar to them. And what we see in our little robots made of robots is you see these little seeds of familiarity or recovery appear within the body of the machine, and it starts to spread outwards. The non-freaking out individual causes its freaking out neighbors to not freak out, who in turn, reduce the freaking outness of their neighbors. And the net result is now when you zoom back out and look at the whole organism, you see the organism catch themselves and not slip on the ice within that 1/10 of a second. And so by changing, focusing the lens, looking inward and back outward, it no longer looks like a magic trick. So what seems like a fundamental problem for robotics, for example, you put an autonomous vehicle in a brand new situation and you want it to not kill people, it matters. And it's a problem that a lot of companies are trying to solve because they're going about things in a fundamentally wrong way. If we completely rethink how we build machines, this problem is no longer a problem. Just because of diversity, just because someone knows what to do, and you get spreading waves of familiarity.
It's interesting. Can I pick up on a couple of points that you had there, a contrast? So part of that ability to recover comes from the heterogeneity, that although most of the components don't know what to do, one component or a small number of components do, which we could explain as a sort of robustness from redundancy sort of story, right? But the other part of the story is much more interesting. The other part of the story is that because one or a small number of components know what to do, that takes the stress out of the others that didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about how that works?
Yes, I can. So this is kind of the tricky part, right? So you're not freaking out, but your neighbors are freaking out, which means you're kind of outnumbered. So how do you break the symmetry? How do you keep the chaos from seeping inward, and meanwhile ensuring or increasing, making it more probable that your calmness will spread outward, right? That seems very difficult. And again, on the surface, seems tricky. So now we have to scale it. We have to zoom out on the temporal scale. So if you think about us made up of cells, cells have been jostling against their neighbors since the very beginning. There's massive experience. This process of getting to know one another has been going on for a very, very long time. And in our hypothetical person who's slipping on the ice, a pair of cells somewhere in their body, they may never have experienced this before, but there is stuff going on between the two cells. There are intercellular ropes or ligaments that hold cells together. There are connectors. There are things that are helping facilitate this relationship.
The fascia, they call it these days.
The fascia, thank you. They have lots of experience. The cells have lots of experience. So this process of getting to know the other, is going on all the time, trillions of times per second throughout your body, throughout your body, throughout your body, throughout every organism on the planet. That's the beautiful stuff, the raw material. And in our little toy dinky experiment that we did, you can actually see that experience accumulating, and it increases the chance that when someone's freaking out, it's less likely to spread to their neighbor, and calmness and familiarity is likely to spread the other way. There's that breaking of symmetry because of this massive amount of experience. And then just finally tying this back to natural induction, you want to get a lot of experience. You want to rub against each other in lots of different ways. Now I'm saying this is going to become the soundbite for this podcast, isn't it? The more different ways you rub up against your neighbors, the better, right? You want not just diversity of components, but diversity of interaction, so that when at the whole body you experience slipping on the ice, something quote unquote new, and when it propagates inward, it becomes less new, more likely to be familiar.
Yeah, interesting. So if you think about it as components that are each doing their own thing independently and differently, it seems magical and mysterious that they would know how to induce calm responses in others. But if instead you think about them as, well, they're always in relationship, they're never doing anything independently, they are always communicating and interacting and finding a way to modulate one another's behavior in a way which creates stability, then it becomes much less mysterious that when you perturb one, the change in the nature of the relationship between the two is naturally to find their harmony again.
That's it.
What is the name of this paper? Because this work's pretty exciting. When is it coming out? What is the name of it?
Not yet. It's still in production. But the key phrase here is that's in the title is morphological diversity. So differences in morphology at all scales inside machines. So we're in this particular paper, we're going, in and down. Richard was talking about out and up a few minutes back.
That's pretty exciting. Richard, I'm not sure if you know, but Josh today posted a pic on X off his blackboard. It said he ticked a few things off a list, and one of them was get milk and eggs. The second one was solve the mind-body problem. He ticked that as well. The last thing that he'd left unticked was pay credit card bills. The mind-body problems.
Now, I will add, I didn't write that on the board. I came in to class. This was our last session of my mind morphology and machine grad seminar, and someone who will go unnamed had already written that on the board. So body problem solved.
Well, Josh, a lot of your work demonstrates how forms of intelligence arise because of their bodies, not in spite of them. What does this teach us about the role of morphology in cognition in this regard?
Be diverse within that. That's it. Is all. That's the way forward. Is all of that was there from the very beginning. It may be that natural selection explicitly selected for diversity at different spatial and temporal scales, but you can also get it for free, like in natural induction. The world literally and metaphorically crushes us all the time, and we collapse, in diverse ways. And the next time we don't necessarily collapse, just, we learn something from that experience. there's so much of that raw experience, those raw dynamics going on long before brains ever showed up. And Mother Nature figured out how to exploit and make use of what's going on within to make anti-fragile constructs, to make organisms that come back, stronger, more capable of adaptation after things happening to them over which they had no control. That there's many arguments in support of embodied cognition, the way in which the body helps us think and do what we do. I'm jazzed about this most recent result because it's kind of so intuitive, yet, we've scoured the literature. Where is it? We haven't, there's so much that we're missing, I think, that maybe in retrospect seems obvious.
It's easy, I think, to miss that point in the story of the work that you're telling in that paper, that you can think of these as components of a body that know how to interact with one another, and miss the idea but that's what cognition is, right? That cognition isn't something which controls body parts. Cognition is the dynamic relationship among parts. And the dynamic relationship among parts that happens inside the brain with neurons and synapses is a particular kind of body part with a particular kind of interaction. But all body parts do that. And the dynamics that happen in the brain wouldn't mean anything if they weren't intimately related to the other parts of the body which they're connected with, right? It's all part of the cognitive system. And that there isn't a categorical distinction between the way that cells communicate with one another in tissues and the way that neurons communicate with one another in brains. That even for organisms which don't have brains, they're still doing cognition there, because the idea that they have bodies but they don't have brains is a category error. It's like, if you have a body, then you already have a large number of diverse components in intimate relationships with one another that are capable of modifying those relationships on the fly. And that's what cognition is. Right? All bodies have that.
This is very much what we were discussing in seminar this morning. Then what are brains for? I think, following on from what Richard said, my answer would be brains accelerate and enrich one part of that kind of cognition. There's cognition going on already, and the brain helps with certain facets of that phenomenon, yet to be determined which ones. It could be computing with representations, which at the moment is very much out of fashion, but maybe that's actually what brains do. That's what bodies do. Among other things, they compute with representations. They're not very good at it. They're kind of slow and error prone. So maybe nervous tissue evolved to help do that small slice of cognition a little bit better, a little bit faster. Who knows?
And keep it connected and grounded to the more embodied kind of cognition.
Absolutely.
I think that's I'm very fascinated by Ian McGilchrist's work on the difference between the two hemispheres and the kind of cognitive styles between them. I think there's that kind of slow thinking, fast thinking cartoon about different cognitive styles, and thinking with representations that involves that may or may not seems to involve representational thinking, manipulating representations. It's like, even if that's a kind of cognition that might be special, but B, you need to do that in such a way that it doesn't become disembodied and disconnected from the meaning of all of those representations.
His work's very fascinating. I've actually got a nice colloquium episode with him and with Ian McGilchrist and Raymond Tallis planned about consciousness. Can consciousness ever be explained by the brain? And they went to dissect that quite a bit. But Richard, when you look at Josh's work and all the things they're doing with xenobots, metamaterials, and now with fundamentally different entities interacting together within other fundamentally different entities, how do you see his work sort of aligning with yours in this way, and how does it assist in you bringing your work further?
Well, so some of the things that we've already talked about are that's a multi-scale cognition story, right? So the idea that there are components which are not just dumb parts, but they are individually adaptive and behavioral components already that form relationships with others and create a whole, right? Those are synergistic questions which are common to us both. There's an area of Josh's work that we haven't talked about. He mentioned it very tangentially about the polycomputing stuff and computing with different frequencies, which really excites me. I was really very inspired by that work about the idea of components forming, for example, materials which have linkages that communicate vibrations from one side of a material to another. I'm paraphrasing it for you, Josh. I should let you do it really, but I'll have a go and you see if I get it right.
Doing wonderfully.
But the nature of those linkages can compute simple logical functions, but the nature of those linkages at different frequencies are different, so that different frequencies are representing different frequencies simultaneously in the same material at the same time. That was a bit redundant, but you got my picture. And I find that really very interesting because it means that what's going on between one level of biological organization and another is not, I was talking to Mike the other day, it's not just that the thing which is that it's happening at the higher level of biological organization, which we might in some contexts think of as analogous to an algorithm. It's not just that that is multiply realizable in lower level substrates, that you can implement it many different ways, but it's also the other way around, that what's going on at the lower level can be interpreted by higher levels in multiple different ways as well. So it's like, there's multiple, this algorithm could be instantiated in these materials or in those materials or this way or that way, and different organizations could have achieved the same algorithm. That's one way to think about it. And the other way to think about it is, yeah, but the physical materials are only doing one thing, right? Well, yeah, they're only doing one thing at that level of description. But when you look at what that's computing, what algorithm does that implement, there are, at this way of looking at it, is like this frequency of looking at it, it's doing this function, but at this frequency of looking at it, it's doing another function. So there's a two-way sort of ambiguity in sort of many-to-one mappings between one level of organization and another, and I think that's fascinating. Did I get it approximately right, Josh?
Wonderful.
Josh, anything about that work you'd like to add on or just elaborate on?
I can't take credit for it. It's my grad students who are pushing this polycomputation idea forward. And just, it's a wonderful time to be running this lab because they come in every week with some new idea about this. I'll try and say this very vaguely. All of machine learning, the whole edifice of machine learning at the moment rests on the back propagation of error. So for the general audience, you present a picture of a kitty cat or a dog to a neural network, or you present a pedestrian or a tumbleweed in front of a moving autonomous vehicle, and it's got to figure out which is which. That information coming into the cameras flows forward through the neural network, and then it either does the right thing or the wrong thing. It computes the error, how much it got wrong and where it got things wrong, and then propagates that backwards through the network up to the cameras again. Forward pass, backward pass. NVIDIA is eating the world because they can create chips that do this forward, backward thing really, really fast, over and over again. And yet there's an assumption that the forward pass happens before the backward pass. If you do these things at multiple frequencies, you can now, one of my students has shown, you can do the forward and backward pass at the same time, at least for me. So there's so much, I feel like a lot of what our community is doing, we're having our quantum mechanics moment, is that so much of what we've talked about in the last hour is, increasingly non-intuitive. I'm struggling to keep holding on to it. And I've heard a lot of this, no offense, Richard, I've heard a lot of this many times before, and it's still hard to hold on to and try and intuit it and propose new experiments to push forward. So it's, it's simultaneously exciting and terrifying. And also, like, the more we do, and Richard mentioned our mutual colleague, Michael Levin. Every time we talk to Mike, he's like, yeah, of course nature does that. Yes, everywhere, at all scale, all spatial. So it's very non-intuitive, but the more you think about it, it seems like that must be the way that Mother Nature is doing it. Why wouldn't she, if she needs to compute, and she needs to compute a lot of things really quickly, why not do it at the same time on different frequency bands? We'll see, but probably, I'm not a biologist, Mike says probably yes, that's probably what's going on. So we're moving into this increasingly non-intuitive world, which is exciting, but also, at least personally, kind of terrifying, because it's hard to find solid ground to stand on.
That's very cool, Josh. Can I say it back to you to see if I got it? So in the polycomputing work that you've told me about before, we can imagine that I imagined it as a feed-forward function, but the nature of the function, whether it was computing NAND or whether it was computing OR, depending on which frequency you were observing it with, which frequency you were using to read the output. But now you're telling me it's not just that there are multiple feed-forward functions that can be happening in the same material at the same time, but whether the causal changes in the reorganization of the system are going from A to B or B to A can be happening simultaneously because they're happening in different frequencies.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Oh, I so want to know more about that.
Okay. I feel bad because, again, this has not appeared in print yet, so I will hesitate to add any more details. But yes, that's exactly it, right? And again, here's a moment of like, oh, why not? If it's possible, you have a complex metamaterial where you've got a whole bunch of things that are vibrating at multiple frequencies simultaneously. The other interesting thing about, not just about polycomputing, but a lot of this stuff, when you start zooming in and out at different spatial and temporal scales, is like a fractal. You can zoom, forever, especially on the frequency band. You can zoom in. If you think about tuning your radio, as long as you've got a good receiver, you can keep going. You can keep zooming in. So in our early polycomputational work, we showed that you can look at two different frequencies and see two different logic gates, but why not three? And if you zoom in, in theory at least, there's an infinite number of computations occurring across the frequency bands. You might not be interested in 99.99% of them, but they're there and possibly exploitable by different agents acting at different spatiotemporal scales. So you're working with a material that already naturally it's just computing functions, possibly an infinite set or a very large finite set. Naturally, you're hitting it. You're literally hitting it. And it's reverberating. It's all there. It's all there.
That makes good sense to me when I think about the relationship between one level of biological organization and another. The idea that, the slow changing structural variables that determine the nature of the interactions between the components, they determine how the behavior of the components works in interaction with one another, because they are the structural variables. Except that the behavior of the fast changing variables over time, over distribution, changes the structural variables. So there is already a two-way process, right? That the weights of a network determine its activations, but the co-activation of the states determines the changes in the weights, right? That's the nature of the two-way relationship between the inference step and the learning step, right? So it makes good sense that those two steps should be and could be much more intimately related than the way that we normally think about them in machine learning, right? The way that we do it in machine learning is so clunky, right? It's like, let's do a whole bunch of learning where we change the weights. Okay, and now let's not change the weights at all and just use them to do inference. And, the innovation with transformers was that, that didn't work, right? Because the strength of the relationship between this word and that word should be context sensitive, but you would need dynamically variable weights to do that, right? But that's what attention is, right? That the data is changing the weights on the fly, but it's still a really clunky way of doing it, right? It's like you've the context sensitivity of the attention is still, we'll bake that in, and then that won't change, and then we'll just do we'll do the attention as though it's not on fixed weights, but it's on these matrices which are still learned and still stable and not changing at runtime. They're not data dependent dynamics, and biology just isn't like that. Biology, it's like the constructions which are being built in my head as I'm beginning this sentence are influencing the words which are coming out at the end. You try saying that without getting tied up in whether you're saying it or whether you're thinking it. But there are these other timescales, or the timescale of this conversation, where we are making our way through the conversation and constructing concepts and trying to hold on to them and pushing them back and forth, which is altering what happens next. On a longer timescale, there are many cycles of activity during the day as activity goes up and down naturally. A nap in the afternoon comes to mind. But also then, you have this other timescale where you go to sleep at night and your brain completely switches off. Okay, that's not true. Your brain's activity drops significantly, and then you have another go the next day. And in the way in which it's important that happens, so that the experience you have today can be different from the experience that you had tomorrow. That needs to be dynamic. And if it was just slowly ossifying day by day, it's like you wouldn't be able to think a new thought. I mean, that's still a bit of a problem in middle age, but that dynamism is the thing that we are missing, right? In the way in which we do artificial neural networks at the moment.
Absolutely.
Yep. I think this, as you guys said, there's so much happening where, Josh, you just mentioned everything's changing. We accept it, we see it, and yet it's still very hard to completely break away from it. And we still tend to go back to these old habits, let's call them for now. But we do see this shift happening. When I think about even the fact that you guys are having this chat about this is a big deal. And then I look at some of the others coming up, even the one we spoke about with Talis and McGilchrist, can consciousness be explained purely with the brain? Then you've got Mike and Robert, they're going to come chat about neuroscience beyond the brain. Someone like Don and Carl Friston are going to come together to chat about inference versus interface. There seems to be a fundamental shift occurring where people are realizing that reality just is completely strange. It's a weird place. There's a lot of strange things going on here. It would be arrogant for us to just assume we know what's going on. But a core theme that's...
Well, I will say, if I can jump in just for a moment, Tevin, I will say, you were inviting us, so we are all an extended family. So I don't know whether we can generalize to the the entire scientific community. I think there's still very much a lot of ways of thinking that are different from what we're talking about.
A valid point. But in general, when you think about it, they're trying to explore this one theme within these few segments. And so I would like you guys to also try and do that for this bit. Consciousness, because that seems to be the fundamental question. When you think about consciousness and you think about this new way of understanding reality, how do you guys see it at this point? Do you guys define it differently? Do you see it as cognition all the way down? Should this all just be clumped together into one new theme? How should we understand what the mind-body problem is and what consciousness is?
Go ahead. You solved that this afternoon, apparently. So tell us, Josh.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Okay, here we go. Deep breath. I start with a disclaimer. I'm an illusionist. I don't think consciousness is actually a thing. It's just a convenient, for now, and a convenient but slightly becoming less convenient concept to hold on to. I will start with where I feel on firm ground. 1,000 years ago, I was a postdoc with Hod Lipson, also a member of our extended family. And Hod and I did some work on a self-aware robot, which I'm okay with. Self-awareness in the literal, uninteresting way in which I think I'm thinking about performing the following action, and I make a prediction about what sensory result is going to occur, and I do that action, and I was right. I'm self-aware. That part, the non-sexy kind of self-awareness. while we were completing that work, Hod and I were having a couple coffees, and Hod was like, well, is the evil starfish, which was the nickname for our black quadrupedal robot that did this trick, is the evil starfish aware that it's self-aware? You know, and so I was thinking about the literal code, and the answer is no, it's not. It's aware of itself, but it's not aware that it's. So then, of course, Hod was like, so how do we do that? How do we make a robot that's aware of its self-awareness? And then I think for Hod, well, I can't speak for Hod, but at least for me, I was like, okay, that's a version of the C word that I'm happy with. Consciousness is, self-awareness all the way down. It's self-referential. It's a definition that doesn't, deal with qualia and kind of sidesteps the hard problem of consciousness. But yeah, it's self-awareness all the way down and possibly all the way up. And that, for me, that's what it is. And when humans look at that self-referentiality, I'm aware that I'm on a podcast with Richard and Tevin. If someone looks at my behavior and says Josh is conscious of the fact that he's on a podcast, I'm okay with that. That's, a short form for that. But again, then, so there's an illusion being passed here by something. It's not an I, it's a we. And then there's an observer, but that observer is also not a singular construct. It is also, so I don't have a clean way of saying it, but that constellation of things that's going on, this observer that's an observer all the way down, and the actor which is presenting an illusion as if it's conscious is also, an actor all the way down, and those things wrapped up, that's the C word, that's consciousness. All right, Richard, you've had some time.
I think it should be treated like a C word and only said in very special circumstances.
Agreed, yes.
I until recently, I'm just not going to talk about it because I just don't know what it is, and I don't know how to say it, and I don't know how to grasp it. I buy the hardness of the hard problem of consciousness, and I'm not qualified to speak of these things. And it's still true that I'm not qualified to speak of them, but I've decided recently, last year, specifically, that that's just a cop-out and I can't do that anymore, right? Because I get pissed off with other people for ignoring the evidence that's in front of them about, how natural selection works or how evolution works or how learning works and, how you interpret these things. And it just can't be like that. And how can you just ignore all of that evidence? And they just say, well, yeah, it's complicated, later for that, right? But that's what I was doing with consciousness. It's like, yeah, I'll do the problems that I can do and I'll ignore the elephant in the room, right? And I don't think it's legit to just ignore the elephant in the room. Which is just to say, I acknowledge the legitimacy of the question, which wasn't even a thing for me, not until recently. I can see the temptation to reach for the awareness of awareness of awareness of awareness, as that's what it is. But I think that it's not clear to me that you couldn't have a system that could do metacognition and still not have any subjective experience of it. In other words, I buy the possibility of the philosopher's zombie that does the same behavior, but that isn't having a subjective experience. The only other thing I have to say about it is analytic idealism that people like Bernardo Kastrup and Don Hoffman advocate for, which I don't know much about, but what I do understand about it is this, that basically, let's start on the other side of the hard problem of consciousness. Let's start with a universe where everything is made out of consciousness, and consciousness creates time and matter and space, instead of starting with time and matter and space and getting stuck with producing consciousness. And for some people, that feels like a different way of doing a cop-out, of just saying, like it's almost like it's, instead of saying it's not a thing, you say it's everything, right? Like you just jump ship, jump to the other side and make it sort of, you explain it by just assuming it pre-exists everywhere. But I think it makes a little bit more sense to me to imagine consciousness creating little thought bubbles, which are like formal systems that are incapable of seeing outside of themselves, which are like little subselves. They talk about the idea of creating a persona in a dream. The persona in the dream is like a character that's within your own consciousness that's doing that. But that character can be surprised by the other things that happen in your dream. It's like, how the hell did that happen? That was all, my brain made all of that up. How can I be surprised by it, right? So if you think of all of our consciousnesses as being like characters within a bigger consciousness, it's the only thing I've heard so far that could possibly get us out of a hard problem of consciousness. Like, so they had, like, you know, I can see how that has, well, some appeal. It has some appeal to me. I'm fully acknowledge that opens, you know, whole other cans of worms, and then perhaps it's not an answer at all, but it's an intriguing way to approach things, is to start on the other side of the problem. And I think the problem requires that kind of fundamental shift for us to get out of this box that we've put ourselves in, where reductionist science removes the meaning and value from everything until we're just machines that don't have any subjective experience, despite the fact that it's the only thing you have is a subjective experience, right? You know, that's the reality, is that the only thing we have is a subjective experience, and that we use that to infer the existence of tables and physical objects and the passing of time. And, you know, despite that, we somehow got ourselves into this situation that we believe that the table is real and our subjective experience isn't. Like, we talk ourselves out of our own existence, which is a weird thing to do.
Well, we're clearly not going to solve the mind-body problem today.
Yeah.
I will point out, if you know, in both accounts you just heard, you know, it's a particular type of plurality, right? Actors of some form within other actors. So if being the operative word, if we're ever going to solve the hard problem or make, you know, progress on it, assuming, you know, assuming or privileging a certain spatiotemporal scale, it's happening in here and not in here, that seems much more precarious and less likely to get us out of the hard problem. As Richard said, we're not out of it yet, but
yeah,
we should really, you know, as Paul Feyerabend said, you know, we need to develop new language and give it like at least 1,000 or 2,000 years, like, you know, the traditional philosophers have had, to work out the implications of this new way of talking about, in this case, the hard problem of consciousness. We're playing the long game here.
Yeah, when I look at some of the work that you guys have both done separately, and a lot of your colleagues, when it all comes together, it's very easy to see someone taking your work, Josh, or your work, Richard, and forming an illusionist framework or forming a panpsychist framework. They're not that different.
Yeah. So a reviewer recently was saying, are you just being ridiculous panpsychists, right? And it's like, okay, look, the idea of cognition all the way down. First of all, I take cognition to be, can you do a certain set of functional capabilities and competencies, not are you having a subjective experience? And then we can talk about, you know, do you have capabilities of memory, learning and adaptive behavior, problem solving, that kind of thing? Can you do that? Does the system do that? Not, does it have a subjective experience of what it's doing, right? Those are different issues. So cognition all the way down doesn't mean consciousness all the way down. Second thing, it's perfectly consistent to say there's some of it in everything, but there are degrees, right? So you don't have to say that individual molecules are just as conscious as multicellular organisms like ourselves are just because there's cognition all the way down. And you can say, you know, there are cognitive capacities in individual cells and there are cognitive capacities in multicellular organisms. They are both cognitive. They are not the same, right? That's consistent. And I think that the right way to think about it is that there also isn't any special level of organization where suddenly something switches on, right? Now you're doing it. Now it's on fire, right? It's like, I don't think it's like that, right? Because, 95% of what we do with our own brains, we don't even know that we're doing it, right? So this little icing on top of that appears to be a single thread of experience is quite precarious as well, and it can be split and it can be lost, and you can do sleepwalking and all sorts of stuff, right? But the reason that it has deeper cognitive abilities is not because neurons and synapses have a special cognitive ability that other layers of biology didn't have. It's just because it's on top of many other layers. Right? What makes it a deeper kind of cognition is that there are many layers beneath it, not because this layer did something that the other layers didn't do. That's my current thinking about it.
I think it's interesting that it could be the case that when you zoom in at any scale, you see some non-zero amount of subjective experience. As an illusionist, I put my chips on the table that when you zoom in at any scale, you're going to see zero subjective experience. But we're just at the beginning. I think it would be really amazing if the true answer is actually not, right? Again, as Richard said, kind of both are kind of extremes. They're a bit of a cop-out. It's either all non-zero at every scale or it's all zeros at every scale. Wouldn't it be amazing that at the end, when we finally get there, like, oh, there actually are certain scales, spatial temporal scales, at which there is no subjective experience at all, and then others where there is a non-zero amount of subjective experience going on. Who knows? That seems like it would be the most interesting thing. I mean, because panpsychism and illusionism are kind of not that interesting in a way, right?
Mm. So do you take
if that's true, what is it?
If I can ask a personal question, do you take your illusionism to the extent that you don't believe you have any subjective experience?
Yes. I don't think I have any subjective experience. It certainly feels like I do. I get the self-reference there, but I'm 51 years old. I realize I've been fooled by lots of people and by the world and by myself. There's optical, intellectual, cognitive illusions everywhere. It's illusions all the way down, but consciousness, that's not an illusion. That one, I'm pretty sure, again, I don't know. I'm not qualified to know, but if I were forced to bet, I'd be like, there's a lot of illusions out there that my gut is tricking me all the time to thinking that the brain is in charge, but my gut is just running my brain. They're everywhere. All these illusions, we domesticated humans or domesticated humans into farmers. That the older I get, the more I look, I'm like, it's illusions. There's illusions everywhere.
All right.
That's where I'm gonna put my chips on the table.
I can feel my Dan Dennett books. They're coming out. They're very excited coming out at the moment. I mean, George, I wrote my dissertation on illusionism because that was the.
I know this.
That is the point. I find illusionism to be the best intuition pumps for other theories of consciousness. That's how I see it today.
That's also why I like it. Right? It doesn't let you rest. It says, let's make sure this is. We were all very interested in putting a lot of effort into studying this thing. Is it a thing?
Yeah, that's exactly because when I started the podcast, I was fundamentally as grounded with my belief that as Josh is right now. But at this point, after exploring it so much, I have no idea. I'm just.
Or you're going back on your illusionist.
I'm super agnostic at this point. I just don't know what's going on. But my intuition is still very much illusionist, and I do love using illusionism as those intuition pumps to critique other theories of consciousness, because I do think that it's one of the best tools we have to do that. But yeah, anyway, let's move on back to the conversation at hand. When we look at your work, guys, you somehow have we're all got together, we get together, and then it gets even deeper, because then it becomes about love, cooperation, and forces that bind. And both your work does this in different ways, but Richard, your work explores love, not just as an emotion, but as a force of integration. So what role does love play in a way systems bind together and remain coherent?
So there's at least two kind of approaches to this. One is one that we've already mentioned, which is that if evolution by natural selection is the prime mover, then competitive self-interest is the prime mover. Some people say that that's already a misappropriation of Darwinistic ideas, and I don't think that it is. In that case, love is just something your genes make you do to ensure their survival and reproduction. It's a brain chemistry trick that makes you act in an altruistic way, but it's not the altruistic feeling isn't the prime mover of anything. It's just a means to an end that was actually self-interested. But if natural selection isn't the prime mover, if the prime mover is a learning process, if what you really are, what the thing that causes systems to change over time, that causes them to evolve, is a tendency to fall into a state of mutual knowing, right? That the way in which one system gets organized by its contact with another system is that it's pushed into a state that makes less friction, that makes it move more easily with that kind of interaction, that they dance more naturally together. That's another way of saying that they know more about each other, that past experience is held in the structural organization of their interactions, which means that they are able to anticipate one another. I'm not just talking about an agent and another agent now, but an agent in interaction with its environment knows about its environment, and the extent that the environment changes its organization over time in response to the agent, it knows back again. It's always symmetric. That mutual knowing is not something that System A can know something about System B as though the knowing didn't change System A. It's like knowing something changes you, right? Knowing something means you're a little bit different than you were when you didn't know it, right? It's not, knowing something isn't just something that you can hold, like writing on a chalkboard. It changes the fabric of who you are, right? And the depth of that change can't be shallow. It has to be deep. The deeper that mutual knowing, it's okay. So first of all, it's about knowing. It's not about survival and reproduction. In a system that the prime mover is learning, that the direction of travel is towards knowing, not towards survival and reproduction. The knowing is mutual, that it's bidirectional. System A knows about System B knows about System A. It's deep, not shallow. And so what you end up with is the last one is vulnerable, that it's not just something which I stay exactly as I am and I know something. It's like, no, in learning something, I'm actually changed. I'm taking a risk there in coming to know you better, because in coming to know you, I have to become a model of you. And in becoming a model of you, I'm not quite who I was before. And that's a vulnerable act. So what's being invited there is deeply vulnerable mutual knowing. It's about knowing, it's mutual, it's deep, and it involves a transformation of the parties, not just something that you sprinkle on top. And I think that in the same way that we take ideas of survival of the fittest and we interpret them as what does that mean for me, right? And the way that we naturally interpret that is it's okay to be competitive and self-interested because that's the natural way of the world, right? If you take this idea and you interpret it as what does it mean for me? What does deeply vulnerable mutual knowing mean to me? It means, well, a word that we use for deeply vulnerable mutual knowing in our everyday lives is love. So that's why, for me, that feeling of relaxing that Josh was talking about it's an invitation to interpret the prime mover of adaptation in the universe as a movement that love is doing the work, right? Not we're doing love so that my genes can survive and reproduce.
Yeah, you know what, Josh, when what Richard is talking about now is exactly why I don't say I'm illusionist as much as I used to. It's probably because of that same thing. When I did this podcast, I started putting myself into the role of every other person, creating a model in my head of their view, trying to interview them on that view, critiquing it while still trying to embody it, though, to a point where I've just completely lost a sense of my own illusionism. It's crazy. Like, I still love using it to critique theories of consciousness, but at this point, I think that some other theories and some people's models are so good and well argued that it's just really difficult. But it comes back to that, is that the more you embody their mindsets, taking their theories, it's not that you just, I don't think it's a cop-out, at least from my side. But I think that it's what you're talking about, Richard, is quite true. That is kind of what happens. What do you think about that? Is it a cop-out?
No, I mean, it's a falsifiable scientific theory. It makes predictions. Yeah. Hey, you made it up. It's, that's the thing, is it can do useful work, without recourse to standard Darwinian evolution. That's something we can subject to experimental validation. So it's interesting from a scientific point of view. And again, also in the context of this conversation, it's more acid on, the illusion of self. As Richard just said, it's not really two agents coming together. I sense, I think, I act in such a way that Richard will continue to be my friend. That'll only get you so far. That explanation, or that way of explaining what's going on right now, only carries so much weight. Again, it's, humans saying, okay, let's talk about careful cause and effect tied to sensor motor processes and ultimately genes. But when you look at two I wanted to say selves, two actors or two complex systems coming together, when they really conform to one another, you can't say that one is leading the dance and that one is following. It's not a good way to account for what's going on anymore. I was talking about in polycomputation, this sort of breaking down of what we see as cause and what we see as effect. I do think cause and effect still exist in this universe. They're there, but we use it too liberally. There are things that we think there has to be a leader in the dance and they have to do things because there's something they want to get out of the relationship, and the other partner either will or won't obey. That doesn't really work. Doesn't work very well.
Yeah. I think if you do everything with frequencies, causes and effects in frequencies and resonance, then if you view things at different, you've already mentioned that if you view things at different frequencies, you see different things, you see different functions, you see different relationships. You didn't change anything. You were just looking at it differently. You were looking at it with a different frequency. And one of the ways in which you can look at things with a different frequency is to look at them with a frequency that, instead of strobing them in a way that they stay still, you strobe them in a way that they're lagging slightly or that they're advancing slightly. Like, you can strobe them in a way that it reverses time. And that way of looking at things gives you causes and effects that go in the other direction. And those are both true, depending on how you look at them, right?
That's it.
A simple way to think about it, you have A causes B and B causes C and C causes A. And if I look at that at that particular resolution of time, I see it as a process which is A causes B causes C. But it is true that A has an effect on C, but indirectly through B. But if I wasn't looking, it would appear that A had a direct effect on C, right? And so I would observe the cause and effect going in the other direction by looking at it at a different frequency. I think that's what agency is, right? So non-agential things, causes produce effects. Agential things, I did this thing because of the effect that it would have, right? Effects produce causes, right? They produce the actions were caused by the effect they would have. And that's what you mean by agency, is that I did it because of the because of the effects that it would have in the future.
Yeah. I think this connects back to what Richard was saying about vulnerability. So if I'm going to assume I'm going to focus my spatiotemporal scale at this scale, the whole body scale, I'm going to see certain cause and effect relationships, or I'm going to start to prospect. I'm going to start to imagine into the future certain possible causes and effects. I'm going to do this and say this to Richard so that he, dot, 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 dot. If I stop doing that, if I practice not privileging any spatiotemporal scale, then in my interaction with Richard, there's actually interactions going on between our two systems all the way down. And sometimes he's doing the pushing and sometimes I'm doing the pushing. It's not so obvious anymore and it's vulnerable. You're exposing a larger surface area to be influenced by the other. And again,
Not
it gets
just
more
the surface,
vulnerable.
Josh, it goes right inside.
There you go. There you go. Okay. You're going to have to seek an R rating for this outcast kind of. But that's again from an embodied cognition point of view, right? That's the thing is geometry, mass, inertia, all these physical, there's so many ways in which two objects can come into contact, and it becomes increasingly difficult. I like the strobe light metaphor that Richard was offering, is like who's leading, who's following. It gets increasingly difficult to hold that assertion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've been thinking about this idea of there's like a turn taking that we do in a conversation, but there's a turn taking that you can do with a physical dynamical system that in some parts of its behavior, the structure of its action is solid enough that it can do work on the world. But in other parts of its behavior, the structure of its organization is sensitive enough that the world can do work on it, that it can be changed by the world. So it goes back and forth between being active but insensitive to being sensitive but inactive. It's like I'm just. What are you doing right now? I'm not doing anything. I'm just listening. I'm allowing the world to do work on me. What are you doing right now? I'm doing work on the world. It's like, aren't you hearing what's happening? No, I'm doing work on it, right? And you can, you think that participating in a conversation is, well, that doesn't change me. I'm just getting information about what Josh thinks. When he says words, it doesn't change me, but it does, right? If I really didn't want to be, if I wanted to eliminate the possibility of being changed by the conversation, I have to stick my fingers in my ears and not listen to it, right? If I'm listening to it, it has the possibility of changing something inside me, and we're going back and forth between being sensitive and being active. But
meanwhile, while you're talking, you're also looking at me and reacting to it. Like it's also that process is happening simultaneously at different scales with different sense modalities.
Yeah. So there's you've broken down a dichotomy that I had, which was, so I have this idea of the spring system, which is being sort of pressed on by the world and then acting on the world, right? It's when you randomize the states and allow it to relax, the springs do action on the positions of the particles, but then the positions of the particles do action on the springs. And you go back and forth between those two things, the inference step and the learning step, and you go back and forth. And I understood that to be different from the way that Friston does it, which is he divides the interface between the system and the world into this part of the interface is the inputs and this part of the interface is the outputs. It's like I didn't make that distinction. There's just an interface, but I'm going to push through it this way and then I'm going to pull through it that way. So it's one set of variables, but you take it in turns. What you've told me in this conversation, Josh, is that we can think about that simultaneously as flowing through the same set of variables simultaneously in both directions. That's very cool.
I think that's a possibility. Yeah, definitely.
I think that it's so incredible, but I think the one thing that would enhance and augment both of your work so much is new linguistic formulations. I think we need some sort of a language that allows us to explore these concepts in much more effective ways. Something like Sanskrit or German. I just think English is doing a poor job at this.
Yeah, I'm a North American. I'm monolinguistic. So are there other non-English languages that,
Same.
do you think there are other languages that accommodate this way of seeing the world better?
Well, if you wanted to talk about the rubbing that you were talking about, Josh, without making the podcast R-rated, you could use tapas, right, from Sanskrit, which talks about accepting our frustration with our interaction with the world as an opportunity for transformation.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, Josh, I'm South African, Cape Town. So in Cape Town, English, I only speak English. So, but I do know, because I am Indian and of heritage, and I do know there's certain words and phrases in Sanskrit, in Hindu, in certain cultures where it just explains so much more with just one single word, like German.
Yeah.
But they cheat because they just stick all the words together. Like anybody can make a word that says, I can do that with one word. Sure, you just take the spaces out.
It's true. It's true. Let's move to Josh, with your work with robots, when they form collectives and cooperate and sometimes help each other in a sense. Do you see this as some sort of a system that develops analogs of sociality or empathy or cooperation?
Cooperation, absolutely. Sociality, do bits of the bot within bot give up something locally for the benefit of the whole? I don't know. That's a good question. In our toy experiment with our robots within robot, the robots at every scale are being forced to try and do the same thing. So there's still a lot of top-down design and optimization, very different from what Richard was talking about. They're still all trying to do the same thing, and they happen to be surrounded by some neighbors that are freaking out. So I don't know if it's very social. It's certainly not altruistic. They have local greedy reasons for doing what they do. Empathy, yeah, again, that's the E word. Empathy. I would say a little bit. It's this getting to know your neighbors, like Richard was saying, this vulnerable knowing. They have to know. They're saying, my neighbor is freaking out. I would like them not to be freaking out for maybe selfish reasons. If I were in their shoes and I were to be pulled in this way, that would cause me to stop freaking out so much. So yes, but again, as a roboticist, I use a less loaded term like theory of mind and, some form of mirror neurons. I know I'm similar to that other in this way. It's probably much more of that. But if you were to look at it from the outside, you would probably say it looks like it's being empathetic. It's really focusing on its particular neighbor that's really freaking out the most, and it's putting all of its effort into trying to, quote unquote, help that neighbor, and it's ignoring the neighbors that are freaking out less. From what I've seen from my students' experiments, it looks very much like empathy. You're sort of saying, wait a second, everyone, we need to do a bit of triage. Let's help our neighbor that's suffering the most. But again, that's kind of in the eye of the observer, or possibly it's an illusion and empathy isn't actually a thing.
Yeah, because then, a question that then arises at the end is, are emotions adaptive algorithms? Like, could emotions, including love, be evolution's way of encoding algorithms for cohesion, learning, stability? What do you guys think?
Richard?
Could what be that? Sorry?
Could emotions, including love, be evolution's way of encoding algorithms for cohesion, learning, or stability, etc.?
Well, you're so
getting deep towards the end.
Yeah. If you were to take a view of the universe that starts with consciousness as the fabric of reality, and physical space, time, and matter as being constructs within that, perhaps that's a starting place where emotions and affect of value, good and bad, are more like the sort of primitives that you begin with, and other emotions are things that you construct through particular combinations of those more primitive notions of affect. Maybe. I mean, in a sense, that's what I'm saying when I say a principle of creation based on deeply vulnerable mutual knowing is love as the prime mover. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Emotions in the sense of how we understand them as the particular kind of primates that we are in these bodies with these brain hormones and the rest of it. Presumably, those are impoverished shadows of the cosmic love that we're talking about, right? They resonate with it, but they're not it, right? I don't want to say that they're illusions or that they're unreal. It's like, no, it really is on the same spectrum, but the emotions that we experience when I feel hangry, for example, I don't think that's a cosmic emotion that constructed the universe, but it's not that your question has some merit to me.
Yeah. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I would tie this back to you were mentioning language. So George Lakoff, with his embodied metaphors, he pointed out how much something that seems non-embodied, like language and poetry and even mathematics, is not connected to the body. You can play this game about embodied metaphors. I look forward to seeing this podcast online in the future. I'm looking back on my opportunity to say this to Richard, and I didn't say it. I regret, in retrospect, I regret. So
say it.
No. Embodied metaphor. So if you think about like the language we use, at least in English, about emotion, right? I was really shaken by that encounter, or I couldn't help myself, or I wear my heart on my sleeve. From an embodied context, those are clues that we think when we privilege the whole body view, we think we're a fortress. Inside the skin, I've got everything. But when you really peer at the physical nature of all of us, we are exposed. We have infinite surface area. We are very vulnerable and sensitive across the frequency spectrum at all size scales. We are all wearing our heart on our sleeves. And so I think trying to address your question, and in the spirit of natural induction, like emotions were there from the beginning. There are so many things that affect us that we can't help by being affected by. And in my view, somewhere along the line during natural selection and evolution, we became aware of that happening to us. And in English, we slapped this word emotion on the top. That emotions, I think, are something that was always there from the beginning. And they're not so much an illusion in the fact that we are affected by all things at all scales all the time. And maybe we're able to turn some of them off for some of the time and trick ourselves into thinking we are in control and we're not being affected by X, Y, and Z. But most of the time we are, and that's a good thing. We are emotional creatures.
So one thing I'll say about that is that this idolizing rationality as a way of doing cognition which is devoid of emotion, right? That we're doing reason free from passion, is an idealization which, to my mind, works in the wrong direction and has disappeared up its own orifice in a bad way. That the only if you go that way, then the things that you're reasoning about have no meaning and have no value. That the way in which we ground anything that we're talking about or anything that we're reasoning about in something that matters is through its connection to the way in which it feels in our bodies, which is how the cognition from the lower levels that we're not consciously aware of shows through into the conscious realm that we are aware of, right? And that's not because, if that happened in my digital computer, I would say, like the fact that the electronic components have got a bit hot and it's beginning to show through and my screen is melting, that would be a bad thing, right? But for intelligence which is actually meaningful, it's consulting the meaning of things means connecting to the lower levels of cognition in the body. That's where the meaning comes from. That's not the body interfering with this pure rationality.
So then, guys, I guess it begs the question, when does a system count as a mind? Is mind defined by learning, self-maintenance, coherence, internal models? What do you guys think? And do minds scale? So can groups swarm ecosystems?
I thought we got through the hard part with consciousness and empathy, but we're still going, huh? Okay. Mind.
I would say that things are minded for a particular observer. So mindedness is not something that's observer independent. So other human beings are minded to me, but to other creatures and other aspects, to an asteroid traveling through space, I may as well be another rock, right? I'm just an object in the way, right? So to that kind of tool, I'm not minded. So mindedness is observer dependent, and it's about how deeply can it transform me, right? In what parts of how deeply into me can it reach? How connected can our relationship be? So we use the word minded to talk about other things like us because they can do that. And when you're, if you were talking to somebody on a Zoom call and you thought, hold on a minute, I think this might be an NPC and not a real person after all, right? And using it's not really minded, that means that something has become shallow in the communication. That the resonance that's happening between you isn't deep anymore. But that will be, that suggests that one bacterium might be minded to another bacterium, but from our scale, you might think that's not a minded thing. That's just a biomechanical chemical machine, right? But if you take it in that observer dependent way, then you don't have this sort of magical threshold where suddenly mind turns on.
I don't have much to add to that. I agree 1,000%. Yeah, in robotics, there's this concept of empowerment, which is you have an agent and it's more empowered if it can perform a greater diversity of actions. And for each one of those diverse actions, if it repeats that action, it can get the same sensory result every time. We are a very empowered species because every time I go inside the rocket, 2 days later, I can see the Earth, rising above the surface of the moon. Like that's a very rare percept for most organisms that have evolved on this planet. We are empowered. We can do lots of things and get reliable results, but that's very much from me out into the world. I love Richard's idea that you could almost invert that. You could observe something and say, how many ways can it reliably affect or connect or reach into me? I bet you could probably formalize this as like the inverse of empowerment.
Interesting.
Love that.
And of course, we don't look very minded to parameciums. We just look like, mountain ranges.
Yeah.
To sort of round up, guys, when we look at all of this together, when we see things like evolution, development, learning, cognition, are these all variations of one universal adaptive process?
Yes.
And then if so, what does that mean for teleology?
I'm sorry, Tevin, I cut you out.
And if so, okay, let's say the answer is yes. What does this mean for the nature of purpose and perhaps teleology, universal teleology? Is there something going on here that's deeper? Is there something deeper at work?
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, what we do when we make a theory about how things work in conventional scientific method, we're making a theory about something out there, but it doesn't affect us to know that. We know it, but the knowing it doesn't change who we are. I was just making a theory about atoms or something. But it does. Like our understanding of the universe and how things work that we gain through various different methods, including science, it's all about how that changes our understanding of ourselves. And not just our understanding of ourselves, but who we think we are, what we think we're supposed to be doing, what we think it all means, what's it for, why am I here, right? Everything we learn about the universe has an effect on questions like that. And that we used to know that that was the reason we were doing things. And somewhere along the line, the scientific method got so up its own arse that it forgot that that's what we were doing, that we were trying to figure out what the meaning of things was, what the meaning of our existence was. And it thought, oh, I'm not doing any such thing. I'm just collecting objective facts about the outside world. It's like, why? Why were you doing that? Right? So that you could have more control over it, so that you could have more predictability over it, so that you could manipulate the world to your will, so that you could accumulate more wealth, so that you could build smarter machines so that they could do it for you. It's like, why were you doing any of that? I think that AI at the moment is brought it to a level where the nonsense that we've been doing is hitting us in the face really hard, right? Like when you're building steam engines, it seemed like, well, I'm doing it so that I can move the coal, right? Or, you know, whatever. So I burn the coal and move the coal. And we're like, now that I think about it, why were we doing that? But now that we're building things, we have so much control and command over the external world that we can build things that are borderline minded. Borderline, they're definitely able to influence us, whether we intend them to or not, whether we believe that they're minded or not. They do influence us. It changes us to have AI in the world. And that's hitting us in the face right now, hitting us in the mind right now. And I think it causes us to stop and think about why we were doing this, right? What process are we participating in when we do this?
I think it's interesting that, like you said, Tevin, maybe all these terms we've been talking about over the last 2 hours, they're all facets of the same thing. And maybe we will ultimately arrive at a full account of human nature that is a grand unifying theory. There's one thing. It's love, it's natural induction, it's X all the way down. That's it. That's the answer. Personally, I hope that's not the case. I hope it's like there's 7 things. They're not there. None of them were the things you thought they were. But in the end, if you want to really understand us, we want an account of us. There's 7 things. That I think would be the most fun answer. And I don't know that I'll live to know, but I think that would be great. Yeah, and then of course why 7? Why not 6? Why not 8? Yeah, exactly. Maybe it is.
I think that's interesting. So I have the feeling like there'll be a sense in which one principle is true for everything, but as soon as you start to apply the principle, it becomes a derivative principle. So that we're it's like it's all one mind, and that explains everything. It doesn't explain anything. It's all one mind, but now you have to know which minds is it split into and what are they doing, right? And now you have to take the point of view of that in order to see what happens next. So it's a bit like saying, if you had a grand unifying theory of the 4 fundamental forces, that'd be great. But it wouldn't mean that you don't want to know what the 4 fundamental forces are. They'd still be there, right? And you'd still need to know about all of the elements, and you'd still need to know about biology and how it all works. And whilst it might all be connected to one principle, it's not like that suddenly answers all of your questions, right? Because the details of the journey that we're on creates its own narrative in a way that matters to what it means to us, right? The principle on its own won't do all the work. No one principle on its own could do all the work. But I like the idea of stopping at 7.
Yeah. Guys, I just want to say that today, as we're speaking right now, my 100th podcast is being uploaded. But this has been one of my favorite conversations I've had in since starting this. So it's been such a
that's all your guests.
It's been such a fun.
It's been great, Tevin. Thank you very much.
I don't want to just end on that note. I just want one last thing I want to ask, if you guys don't mind.
I got to go and cook dinner.
Just a quick one. It's going to be that when you look back at the last 2 hours, I mean, I have to ask you, why did we get together? Why was it important? And what has come out of it that you think made this worth the get together?
Why did we come together? I love you guys.
Yeah.
That's why. It's fun.
Yeah, let's do it.
I'd rather do this than sit in my office by myself. I'm going to come away from this. I'm going to come away from this a different person.
Yeah, I agree. It is all about just enjoying the journey of practicing love.
Yeah. I think it was an absolutely wonderful conversation, and I enjoyed it very much. And I will definitely take this as one of my most loving episodes of all time.
Had a great time.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Tevin.
And yeah,
Thanks so much.
Nice to see you, Josh.
as well.
Nice to see you, Richard. Okay, till next time.
Cheers, guys.
Bye
Till
for
next
now.
time.